What would you do if a casual evening walk with your dog turned into a life-or-death nightmare? When a struggling single mother's massive Neapolitan mastiff started frantically digging in the muddy Appalachian woods, she thought he'd found a buried animal. Instead, he unearthed a human hand. But the man buried beneath the dirt wasn't dead yet. He was the head of the most ruthless crime syndicate on the East Coast, and saving his life meant sealing her own fate. This isn't a movie script. This is a story of survival, betrayal, and a terrifying romance that will leave you breathless. The rain in the Blackwood Forest didn't just fall, it assaulted the earth. It was a torrential, freezing November downpour that turned the dense Appalachian woods of Carbon County, Pennsylvania, into a treacherous landscape of deep mud and slick roots. Natalie Brooks tightened the collar of her worn, waterproof jacket, shivering as the icy water seeped through the seams. At 31, Natalie was exhausted in a way that sleep could no longer fix. A grueling custody battle, a bitter divorce from a deadbeat ex-husband, and the crushing weight of medical debt had forced her out of Philadelphia and into this cheap, isolated rental cabin. She was an ER trauma nurse, pulling double shifts just to keep the lights on and keep her 7-year-old son, Liam, fed and blissfully unaware of their financial ruin. Walking with her was Goliath. He was 160 pounds of slate-grey, heavily wrinkled muscle, a purebred Neapolitan mastiff. Most people were terrified of him. With his massive, blocky head, loose jowls and amber eyes that seemed to constantly calculate threats, he looked like a gargoyle brought to life. But to Natalie, he was her only line of defense, a fiercely loyal guardian who slept at the foot of Liam's bed every night. "Come on, Goalie," Natalie urged, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the wind. "Let's head back. Liam's going to wake up from his nap soon." Goliath didn't move. He had stopped dead in his tracks about 50 yards off the main deer trail. His massive head was lowered, his loose skin pooling around his neck. A low, vibrating growl started in his broad chest, a sound that made the hairs on Natalie's arms stand up. "Goliath, leave it. It's just a raccoon," she said, tugging on the heavy-duty leash. The mastiff ignored her. He lunged forward, nearly pulling Natalie off her feet, and began digging frantically at a patch of freshly overturned earthas at the base of a massive, rotting oak tree. Mud flew into the air as his giant paws tore through the soil, roots, and wet leaves. "Stop! Golly, no!" Natalie yelled, stumbling over a root as she tried to pull him back. But Goliath barked, a sharp, deafening sound, and dug harder. Natalie finally managed to plant her boots in the mud and hauled back on the leash. "I said stop!" Goliath backed away, panting heavily, his massive paws coated in thick brown sludge. He whined, a high-pitched, anxious sound that was entirely out of character for the stoic dog, and nudged the mud with his snout. Natalie shined her heavy mag-light flashlight into the shallow depression the dog had excavated. Her breath caught in her throat. The beam of light illuminated something pale and stark against the dark, wet earth. Fingers. It was a human hand. A wave of pure, paralyzing nausea washed over her. She stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It landed in the mud, its beam casting eerie, elongated shadows through the trees. Her mind screamed at her to run, to grab Goliath, sprint back to the cabin, lock the doors, and dial 911. But then the fingers twitched. It wasn't a trick of the light. The index finger scraped weakly against the mud. He's alive. Natalie's paralyzing fear was instantly overridden by 8 years of trauma-warred instincts. She fell to her knees in the freezing mud, ignoring the rain lashing against her face, and began digging with her bare hands. She tore through the wet soil, her fingernails breaking against hidden rocks. "Help me, Goalie! Dig!" she cried out. The mastiff, sensing her urgency, joined her, using his massive paws to sweep away heavy clumps of earth. Within minutes, she uncovered a man's face. His skin was a horrific shade of bruised violet and chalk white. His mouth was securely wrapped with silver duct tape, and his eyes were swollen shut. Blood from a deep laceration on his hairline had mixed with the mud, caking his dark hair to his skull. Natalie frantically ripped the tape from his mouth. He didn't gasp. He didn't move. She pressed her trembling, mud-caked fingers against his carotid artery. The pulse was there, thready, erratic, and dangerously weak. He was deep into severe hypothermia, and by the look of the blood soaking through the soil around his torso, he was bleeding out. Working like a woman possessed, Natalie uncovered his chest and arms. His wrists were bound behind his back with heavy-duty industrial zip ties. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out the trauma shears she always carried on her scrubs. She had forgotten to take them out after her shift. With a desperate squeeze, she snapped the thick plastic ties. She managed to haul him by the shoulders, dragging his dead weight out of the shallow grave. He was a large man, heavily muscled and clad in a ruined, custom-tailored dark suit that spoke of money and power, who wore a bespoke suit in the Blackwood forest. Okay, stay with me," Natalie muttered, patting his freezing cheek. "Goliath, guard!" The mastiff stood over the man, facing the dark woods, letting out a low, continuous rumble to warn off any predators, or whoever had put the man in the ground. Natalie knew she couldn't carry him. She dragged him by his armpits, inch by agonizing inch, through the mud. Her muscles burned, and her lungs screamed in the freezing air. It took her 20 minutes of grueling, back-breaking labor to drag him the 100 yards to her property line, where she kept an old, rusted metal wheelbarrow for firewood. Heaving with everything she had, she managed to roll his lifeless body into the wheelbarrow. Her hands were bleeding, her clothes were soaked through, and she was terrified. But she pushed, through the rain, through the mud, towards the single yellow porch light of her cabin. Natalie maneuvered the wheelbarrow up the wooden ramp to her back porch, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. She left Goliath outside to stand watch, locking the heavy deadbolt behind her as she half-carried, half-dragged the unconscious man onto the worn hardwood floor of her kitchen. The cabin was silent. A quick glance at the baby monitor on the kitchen counter showed Liam sound asleep in his bed upstairs, clutching his stuffed bear. Thank God! Natalie turned her attention back to the man bleeding out on her floor. Under the harsh fluorescent kitchen lights, his condition looked even worse. He was arguably handsome, with sharp aristocratic features, a strong jawline, and a shadow of dark stubble, but his face was battered to a pulp. She ran to her bathroom and dragged out her trauma kit. It wasn't a standard first aid box. It was an extensive, well-stocked bag she had pieced together from surplus medical supplies, IV bags, sutures, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and hemostatic gauze. Living an hour away from the nearest hospital required preparation. She knelt beside him and used her shears to cut away the ruined, muddy fabric of his suit jacket and dress shirt. Beneath the expensive fabric, his torso was a canvas of violence. He had defensive bruising across his ribs, but the real danger was a puncture wound on his lower left abdomen. It looked like a knife wound, deep, but thankfully missing the major arteries. Natalie worked with cold, clinical precision. She cleaned the wound with betadine, packed it tightly with hemostatic gauze to stop the bleeding, and secured it with pressure bandages. She started an IV line in his bruised forearm, hanging a bag of warmed saline from the cabinet handle to combat the severe hypothermia. She stripped him of his wet clothes, wrapped him in 3 heated thermal blankets, and positioned a space heater near him. As she worked, she checked his pockets. No wallet, no ID, no phone. Just a heavy gold signet ring on his right hand, engraved with an intricate crest, a wolf holding a dagger. It was 2 a.m. when the bleeding finally stopped, and his core temperature began to slowly rise. Natalie sat back on her heels, wiping sweat and mud from her forehead. She reached for the kitchen phone mounted on the wall. She had stabilized him, but he needed a hospital. He needed police. Her fingers had barely brushed the receiver when a hand, cold, bruised but terrifyingly strong, clamped around her wrist like a steel vice. Natalie gasped, dropping the receiver. It dangled by its coiled cord, emitting a dull dial tone. The man's eyes were open. They were a striking, piercing shade of dark grey, and despite the fact that he was half dead, they burned with a terrifying, predatory intensity. "Phone down," he rasped. His voice was gravelly, broken from the dirt and the cold, but it carried an undeniable authority. "You need a hospital," Natalie said, trying to pull her wrist away. His grip only tightened, painfully so. "You are buried alive. You have a deep laceration to your abdomen. I have to call an ambulance." "No cops," he choked out, coughing weakly. He tasted copper and dirt. "No hospitals." "You don't understand. I'm a nurse. But I don't have the equipment." With a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline, he pulled her closer, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "You call the cops, and we both die. They own the dispatcher. They hear the call. They come finish the job." Natalie froze. Who comes?" He stared at her, assessing her panic, her innocence, the medical supplies scattered around her. He noted the baby monitor glowing softly on the counter. "You have a kid," he whispered, his eyes flicking to the monitor and back to her. "If they find me here, they won't leave witnesses. Not you, not the kid. Hang up the phone." Natalie's heart slammed against her ribs. The threat wasn't delivered with malice. It was delivered as a cold, undeniable fact, a statement of reality. She slowly reached down and placed the receiver back on the hook. The click echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. The man released her wrist, his arm falling heavily back to the floor. His eyes fluttered shut as exhaustion overtook him again. "Smart girl," he murmured, before slipping back into unconsciousness. Natalie sat on the floor, her breathing shallow and fast. What had she done? She hadn't just saved a victim. She had brought a ghost into her home. A man who was targeted by people powerful enough to intercept police dispatches. She looked at the baby monitor. Liam rolled over in his sleep, completely safe, completely oblivious. Natalie walked over to her kitchen drawers, bypassed the silverware, and pulled out her late father's heavy stainless steel Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum. She checked the cylinder, fully loaded. She placed the gun on the kitchen island, pulled up a wooden stool, and sat vigil over the sleeping mobster, waiting for the sun to rise. The morning light broke through the kitchen windows, casting long, pale streaks across the floorboards. The storm had passed, leaving the forest outside shrouded in a thick, eerie fog. Natalie hadn't slept a wink. She had spent the night swapping out IV bags, monitoring the stranger's vitals, and keeping the fire stoked. At 6 a.m., she let Goliath inside. The massive dog immediately padded into the kitchen, sniffed the man wrapped in blankets, and then, surprisingly, laid his heavy head across the man's shins, settling down with a deep sigh. At 8 a.m., the man woke up. This time there was no panic. He didn't flinch. His grey eyes snapped open, sharp and lucid, instantly taking in his surroundings. He noted the medical tape on his arm, the IV drip, the bandage on his stomach, the massive beast resting on his legs, and finally, Natalie, sitting 10 feet away with a loaded .357 Magnum, resting on the counter beside her. He didn't look afraid of the gun. If anything, the corner of his bruised mouth twitched upward in a faint, grim smirk. "You know how to use that, Florence Nightingale?" he asked, his voice stronger now, though still raspy. "I know it doesn't have a safety, and it has a hair trigger," Natalie said evenly, keeping her distance. "Who are you?" He slowly propped himself up on his elbows, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitched abdomen. He looked down at the mastiff. "Nice dog. Neapolitan. Roman war dogs, they usually tear strangers apart. Why didn't he eat me?" "He's the one who found you," Natalie said. "Who are you?" she repeated, her voice hardening. The man sighed, leaning back against the base cabinets. "My name is Matteo Romano." Natalie searched her memory, but the name meant nothing to her. She was a nurse in rural Pennsylvania. She didn't keep up with Philadelphia or New York crime syndicates. "Should that mean something to me?" she asked. Matteo looked at her, genuinely surprised. I suppose not. And it's better that way. Let's just say I am a man in the logistics business, and my vice president decided it was time for a hostile takeover. The people who buried you. Vincenzo, Matteo corrected, his eyes darkening with a cold, terrifying rage. My younger brother, and Pietro, my second in command. They ambushed me at a meeting in the city, shot my driver, drove me out to this godforsaken forest to let me suffocate in the dirt. They wanted me to suffer. He looked at Natalie. You interrupted their funeral arrangements. Natalie felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. You need to leave. As soon as you can walk, you need to get out of my house. I have a son. I know, Matteo said softly, glancing at the toy trucks neatly lined up in the corner of the living room. And I owe you my life. In my world, a life debt is absolute. I will not let harm come to you or your boy. The best way to do that is to leave, she snapped. If I walk out that door right now, I bleed out in a mile, or Vincenzo's sweepers find me, Matteo said practically. They won't just assume I'm dead. When they realize the grave was dug up, they will canvass this entire mountain. They will check every cabin. As if summoned by his words, Goliath suddenly lifted his head. His ears swiveled forward. The low, rumbling growl started in his chest again. Natalie froze. The distinct sound of tires, crunching over the gravel of her long, winding driveway, echoed through the quiet morning. She grabbed the revolver. Matteo's demeanor shifted instantly. The injured, exhausted man vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating predator. Despite his severe wounds, he forced himself to his feet, leaning heavily against the counter, his face pale with agony. "Hide the IV," he ordered, his voice barely a whisper. "Kick the bloody clothes under the rug, now!" Natalie scrambled, ripping the IV line down and throwing the bloodied towels into the pantry. "Go to the door," Matteo instructed, pressing himself into the blind spot behind the kitchen wall, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. "Hold the dog by the collar. Be an annoyed, exhausted single mother. You heard nothing. You saw nothing." A heavy knock rattled the front door. Natalie took a deep breath, her hands shaking. She shoved the revolver into the back waistband of her jeans, pulling her long sweater down to cover it. She grabbed Goliath's thick leather collar. She walked to the door and pulled it open just a crack, keeping the chain lock engaged. Standing on her porch was a man in a dark, water-resistant trench coat. He didn't look like a local. He had the cold, dead eyes of a shark, and his right hand was resting casually inside his coat pocket. "Can I help you?" Natalie asked, forcing an edge of irritation into her voice. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, ma'am. Sorry to bother you so early. I'm a private investigator looking for a missing person. A guy went hiking out here yesterday and hasn't checked in. Large guy, dark hair, wearing a suit. You wouldn't happen to have seen anything strange last night, would you?" Goliath slammed his massive weight against the door, barking viciously, snapping his massive jaws inches from the crack in the door. The investigator took a quick step back, his eyes widening at the size of the beast. "Quiet, Goalie!" Natalie shouted, struggling to hold him back. She looked back at the man. "Does it look like I'm out hiking? I was dealing with a flooded basement and a sick kid all night. I haven't seen anyone." The man's eyes scanned the porch, lingering on the muddy tracks Natalie had tried to wash away. "Are you sure? We found some disturbed earth near your property line." "Yeah, my dog hunts raccoons. He digs up the whole damn yard," Natalie lied smoothly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Now, if you don't mind, my son is sleeping, and you're upsetting my dog. If you want to look for hikers, call the rangers." She didn't wait for a response. She slammed the door shut, locking the deadbolt with a loud click. She stood there, barely breathing, listening. After a long, agonizing minute, she heard the crunch of boots on gravel, followed by a car engine starting and fading down the driveway. Natalie turned around. Matteo was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, clutching his bleeding side. his grey eyes locked onto hers with a mixture of respect and grim realization. "They found the grave," Matteo said quietly. "He bought the story for now, but he'll be back with heavily armed friends once he reports in." He looked around the small, cozy cabin, then back to Natalie. "Pack a bag for you and your son," the Mafia boss commanded. "We have 20 minutes before they burn this house to the ground." Adrenaline flooded Natalie's system, entirely erasing her bone-deep exhaustion. She didn't argue with Matteo. The cold certainty in his slate-grey eyes told her everything she needed to know. The man on her porch was a scout, and the executioners were already on their way. She sprinted up the narrow wooden stairs to Liam's bedroom. Her 7-year-old son was curled beneath his superhero blanket, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. "Liam, honey, wake up," Natalie whispered, shaking his small shoulder gently but firmly. Liam groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, is it time for school?" "No, buddy. We're going on a surprise camping trip. Right now." She pulled a sturdy canvas duffel bag from the closet and began throwing in his clothes. Jeans, heavy sweaters, extra socks. "Get dressed, the fastest you've ever gotten dressed in your life." Downstairs, the heavy thud of footsteps told her Matteo was moving. When she came back to the kitchen, carrying Liam and the duffel bag, she found the Mafia boss pale and sweating, but standing. He had rummaged through her laundry basket and pulled on a pair of her ex-husband's old grey sweatpants and a dark flannel shirt. He had also located her father's spare ammunition box and was calmly loading extra .357 rounds into his pockets. "My car is out back," Natalie said, her voice trembling slightly as she handed him the keys. "It's a 2012 Subaru Outback. Not fast, but it handles the mud." "It's perfect. Blend in," Matteo grunted, wincing as he straightened up. He looked at Liam, who was staring wide-eyed at the battered, bruised stranger in his kitchen. Matteo's hardened expression softened just a fraction. "You must be Liam. I'm a friend of your mum's. We have to play a game called Absolute Silence for a little while, okay?" Liam nodded, clinging tighter to his mother's neck. "Let's move," Matteo ordered. Natalie ushered Liam and Goliath out the back door, down the porch steps, and toward the rusted Subaru parked under a canopy of dying pines. The freezing rain had started again, slicking the mud. She strapped Liam into his booster seat in the back, while Goliath jumped into the trunk space, his massive frame taking up the entire rear window view. Matteo slid into the passenger seat, his breathing shallow. He kept the Smith & Wesson resting on his lap, the barrel pointed towards the floorboards. "Don't turn on the headlights until we hit the main county road," Matteo instructed, as Natalie slid behind the wheel. "Take the old logging trail behind the property, not your driveway." Natalie turned the ignition. The old engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. She threw it into drive and steered off the gravel, the Subaru's tires spinning in the wet earth before catching traction. They were barely 200 yards deep into the dense tree line when the assault began. Through the rearview mirror, Natalie saw the glow of headlights cutting through the morning fog. 3 blacked-out Chevrolet Tahoes tore up her gravel driveway, boxing in her small cabin. "Don't stop," Matteo commanded, his voice cold. "Keep driving. Do not look back." Natalie couldn't help it. She stole one more glance in the mirror. 5 men piled out of the SUVs, carrying short-barreled tactical rifles. The man in the trench coat from the porch was leading them. He kicked her front door completely off its hinges with a sickening crack that echoed through the woods. Tears of pure, terrifying realization pricked Natalie's eyes. They weren't there to ask questions. They were there to slaughter whoever was inside. If Matteo hadn't woken up, if she had trusted the police, she and Liam would be dead on their kitchen floor. "Mum!" Liam whimpered from the back seat, sensing her terror. "It's okay, baby," Natalie choked out, keeping her eyes glued to the dark, treacherous logging road, navigating purely by the dim, grey morning light filtering through the trees. "We're just playing the game." Goliath let out a low, menacing bark from the trunk, staring intently out the back window at the fading silhouette of the cabin. "Where are we going?" Natalie asked, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "They'll track my plates. My ex-husband, Derek, works at a dealership in Scranton. He has all my vehicle info. If Vincenzo's men are as powerful as you say, they can find me." Matteo looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Your ex-husband? He's not in the picture?" "He ruined my credit, left me with $40,000 in medical debt when Liam got sick, and vanished so he wouldn't have to pay child support," Natalie said bitterly, the words tumbling out, fueled by adrenaline. "I work 80 hours a week, just to keep a roof over our heads. And now, thanks to you, I don't even have that roof." Matteo was silent for a long moment, absorbing the profound injustice of her reality. A woman who spent her life saving others, crushed by a coward, now forced to flee her home because she had extended that same mercy to him. "Take Interstate 80 West," Matteo finally said, his tone shifting into something dangerously protective. "Head towards the Delaware Water Gap. I have an old, off-the-books warehouse in Easton. It's owned by a man named Silas, a retired associate who owes me his life, just like I owe you mine." He looked out the rain-streaked window, his jaw tightening. "You saved me from a grave, Natalie. I promise you, when I take back my city from Vincenzo, I will make sure the people who hurt you dig graves of their own." The drive to Easton took 2 agonizing hours. Natalie stuck strictly to the speed limit, blending in with the morning commuter traffic and commercial semi-trucks on I-80. In the passenger seat, Matteo's condition was deteriorating. The adrenaline that had carried him out of the cabin was wearing off, leaving him feverish and shivering violently, despite the car's heater blasting at full capacity. By the time they pulled into the industrial outskirts of eastern Pennsylvania, Matteo was drifting in and out of consciousness. Following his strained directions, Natalie navigated through a maze of abandoned textile mills and rusted train tracks until they reached a heavily fortified, unmarked garage surrounded by chain-link fencing. Before Natalie could even park, the heavy corrugated metal door rolled up. Standing inside was an older man with a thick white beard, a mechanic's jumpsuit, and a modified Remington 870 shotgun resting casually over his shoulder. "Drive in," Matteo rasped, cracking his window. Natalie pulled the Subaru into the cavernous, dimly lit garage. The metal door slammed shut behind them, plunging them into artificial light. Silas approached the car, lowering his weapon as he recognized the man in the passenger seat. "Mother of God, boss," the old man breathed, pulling Matteo's door open. "Word on the street is that you were taken out in Philadelphia last night. Vincenzo is calling a sit-down with the commission tomorrow to claim the seat." "Vincenzo is going to have a very short reign," Matteo managed to say, leaning heavily on Silas as he climbed out of the car. "We need a secure room. And I need a doctor." "I'm a trauma nurse," Natalie interjected, stepping out of the driver's side. She opened the back door, unbuckling a terrified Liam, while Goliath leaped out, immediately placing himself between Natalie and Silas, his hackles raised. Silas eyed the massive dog, and then looked at Natalie with deep respect. "You're the one who pulled him out of the fire, huh? Come on, upstairs. The loft is secure and fully stocked." The loft above the garage was a stark contrast to the gritty exterior. It was a high-end, heavily soundproofed safe-house apartment, complete with a modern kitchen, a heavy leather sofa, and a king-sized bed. Matteo collapsed onto the bed, his breathing ragged. The stitches Natalie had put in earlier had torn during their escape, and fresh blood was seeping through his shirt. "Silas, take Liam into the kitchen and find him something to eat. Keep the dog with you," Natalie ordered, her professional persona snapping back into place. "I need hot water, clean towels, and if you have a medical kit, bring it now." For the next hour, Natalie worked relentlessly. She cleaned and resutured Matteo's abdominal wound, administering a strong dose of broad-spectrum antibiotics and painkillers she found in Silas's impressively stocked underground medical supply. When she finally finished, she sat on the edge of the mattress, her hands trembling as the reality of the morning finally crashed over her. She was a fugitive. Her home was likely ashes. She was harboring a Mafia kingpin. Matteo watched her from the pillows, his sharp grey eyes tracking the subtle shake of her hands. The painkillers were kicking in, smoothing the harsh lines of agony on his face, revealing the striking aristocratic features beneath the bruises. "You're shaking," he observed softly. "I'm terrified," Natalie admitted, refusing to look away from his intense gaze. "My whole life was about keeping my head down, paying my debts, and protecting my son. Now I'm sitting in a mob safe house." Matteo reached out, his large, warm hand wrapped gently around her trembling fingers. The contrast was startling, the calloused, dangerous hands of a killer holding the precise, healing hands of a nurse. A jolt of electricity shot up Natalie's arm at the contact. "Your old life was a cage built by a man who didn't deserve you," Matteo said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated in the quiet room. "You said he left you with debt. He left you to drown." "And you're a better alternative?" Natalie countered, though she didn't pull her hand away. "I'm a monster, Natalie," Matteo said with brutal honesty. "I control the ports, the unions, the underground economy of 3 major cities. I have done terrible things to build my empire. But I have a code. I protect what is mine. And right now, you and Liam are mine to protect." The possessiveness in his tone made Natalie's breath hitch. It wasn't the controlling, demeaning possession of her ex-husband. It was a primal, absolute declaration of security. "Why did your brother do it?" she asked, desperately needing to change the subject before she surrendered entirely to the magnetic pull of the man beside her. Matteo's jaw tightened. "Greed. Vincenzo always wanted the crown, but he lacked the discipline. He wanted to traffic in things I strictly forbade. Narcotics, human cargo. I shut his operations down. I humiliated him in front of our captains. I should have put a bullet in his head then, but he was my blood." He scoffed bitterly. He didn't share that sentiment. "So what happens now?" "Now I heal," Matteo said, his thumb slowly tracing the back of her hand, sending shivers down her spine. "Silas will reach out to the few captains I know are absolutely loyal. We gather our strength in the shadows, and when Vincenzo sits at the head of my table, thinking he has won," Matteo's eyes darkened into 2 chips of black ice, "we tear his world apart." He looked back up at Natalie, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly as he took in her tired, beautiful face. "But first, I need to make sure you are safe. Silas is going to wipe your digital footprint. Derek won't be able to find you. The debt collectors won't be able to find you. As of today, Natalie Brooks is a ghost." Tears, hot and unbidden, spilled over Natalie's eyelashes. She hadn't realized how heavy the burden of her past had been until this battered, dangerous man offered to simply erase it. "You don't have to do that," she whispered. Matteo pulled her hand closer, pressing his lips gently to her knuckles. It was an old-world gesture of profound respect, but the heat of his mouth against her skin ignited a spark of undeniable, dangerous desire. "I owe you my life, Natalie," he murmured against her skin. "Erasing a coward's debt is just the beginning." 3 days passed in the underground safe house, a period of suspended reality where the outside world ceased to exist. In the dim, quiet confines of the loft, a profound shift occurred between the hardened Mafia boss and the exhausted trauma nurse. Matteo's superhuman resilience, aided by Natalie's meticulous medical care, saw his wounds knitting together faster than science could easily explain. He spent his hours meticulously reviewing blueprints and making encrypted calls on burner phones Silas provided, rallying the remnants of his loyal empire. But no matter how deep he was in cartel logistics, his slate-grey eyes constantly tracked Natalie. He watched the gentle, fiercely protective way she interacted with Liam, reading him stories and keeping his spirits high despite their confinement. He noted the dark circles under her eyes, the lingering trauma of her past life, and the way she flinched whenever a sudden noise echoed from the garage below. Every flinch ignited a quiet, terrifying rage in Matteo's chest. He had spent his life commanding ruthless men, but this woman, with her gentle hands and unbreakable spirit, commanded a different kind of loyalty from him. Late on the third evening, the heavy metal door of the garage rolled up, and a sleek, armored Mercedes SUV slipped inside. Natalie, who had been washing dishes in the small kitchenette, froze. Goliath immediately positioned himself at the top of the stairs, a low, guttural warning rumbling in his massive chest. "Stand down, Goalie," Matteo ordered softly, stepping out of the bedroom. He was wearing a fresh black dress shirt and dark slacks Silas had procured. Though he moved with a slight stiffness, the aura of a king returning to his throne was undeniable. "It's Dante, my most trusted captain." Footsteps echoed on the metal stairs. Dante, a towering, broad-shouldered man with a scarred jawline and sharp, calculating eyes, reached the landing. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Matteo standing there, very much alive. "Boss," Dante breathed, dropping his head in a deep, reverent nod. "Vincenzo told the commission you were gunned down in an alley by a rival crew. He's calling a vote tomorrow night at the Grand Estate to solidify his position as the head of the Romano family." Vincenzo was always impatient, Matteo sneered coldly, walking over to the heavy oak dining table. "Who stands with him?" "Pietro and the northern captains who want a cut of the narcotics trade. But there's a complication, boss." Dante hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Natalie, who stood frozen by the sink. "Speak," Matteo commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Vincenzo knows he didn't finish the job. His sweepers found the empty grave, and they found the cabin. They tore it apart." Dante reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder, tossing it onto the table. "They didn't find you, but they found out who owns the property. Vincenzo put a massive bounty on the woman and the kid. He wants no witnesses." Natalie felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees threatened to buckle. "How did they get her name so quickly?" Matteo demanded, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register. "The property was a cash rental under a defunct LLC. Dante grimaced. "They didn't use real estate records, boss. They used the ex-husband." Natalie gasped. "Derek?" "Yeah," Dante said, looking at her with grim sympathy. "Your ex-husband, Derek. Turns out he's a degenerate gambler. He owed 50 grand to one of Vincenzo's loan sharks in Scranton. When Vincenzo's men started shaking down anyone connected to that cabins region, Derek saw an opportunity. He sold them your exact location, your license plate, and Liam's school schedule in exchange for his debts being wiped clean. He sold you out to the cartel for a clean slate." A ringing sound filled Natalie's ears. Derek had always been a selfish, cruel man, but this, he had knowingly handed his own son over to a Mafia hit squad just to save his own skin. The sheer, suffocating betrayal of it crushed the air from her lungs. She gripped the edge of the counter, tears of helpless fury stinging her eyes. Suddenly a warm, heavy hand rested on the small of her back. Matteo stepped close, his presence a solid wall of dangerous, intoxicating heat against her side. "Natalie, look at me," Matteo said. She turned her tear-streaked face up to him. "He sold you to the wolves," Matteo whispered, his grey eyes flashing with a terrifying, predatory promise. "So, I am going to feed him to them. Tonight." Rain bashed against the windows of the abandoned warehouse in Scranton. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly tense. Natalie sat in the shadows of the catwalk, Goliath's heavy head resting securely in her lap. She wasn't here to participate in the violence, but Matteo had insisted she witness the dismantling of her nightmare. "You need to see the monster under your bed, dragged into the light, so you never fear him again," Matteo had told her. Below, illuminated by a single harsh, swinging industrial light bulb, Derek was strapped securely to a metal chair. He was bruised, pathetic, and hyperventilating. His expensive suit, undoubtedly bought with money he claimed he didn't have for child support, ruined with dirty water. Dante and two other heavily armed enforcers stood in the periphery, silent as statues. Matteo stepped into the circle of light. He moved with slow, deliberate, lethal grace. He dragged a metal chair across the concrete floor, the grating sound making Derek flinch violently, and sat down backward, resting his arms on the backrest, inches from Derek's terrified face. "Do you know who I am, Derek?" Matteo asked, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. No. Look, I don't have the money. I made a deal with Vincenzo's guys. The debt is clear," Derek babbled, sweat pouring down his pale face. "I am Matteo Romano," he said simply. Derek stopped breathing, the color completely washed out of his face. Even a degenerate civilian gambler knew the name of the most powerful boss on the East Coast. "You made a deal with my traitorous brother," Matteo continued, pulling a thick stack of papers from his coat. "You traded the life of your ex-wife and your own son to clear $50,000. I didn't know they were going to hurt Liam. I swear to God," Derek sobbed. "You are a liar and a coward," Matteo stated flatly. He tossed the papers onto Derek's lap. "Do you know what these are? Dante paid a visit to your bank. These are the transfer deeds to your car dealership, the title to your luxury condo, and the complete liquidation of your offshore accounts. Everything you hid during the divorce." Derek stared at the papers, trembling violently. You took everything." "No," Matteo corrected, leaning in closer, his eyes cold as the grave he had crawled out of. "I transferred everything to a trust fund for Liam, and I paid off the $40,000 in medical debt you illegally dumped on Natalie. You are now entirely bankrupt, destitute." Derek began to weep uncontrollably. "Now," Matteo said, standing up and towering over the broken man, "look up at the catwalk." Derek shakily lifted his head. In the shadows, he saw Natalie standing there, flanked by the massive, terrifying silhouette of Goliath. "Apologize to her," Matteo ordered, drawing his customized, suppressed tactical pistol and pressing the cold barrel directly against Derek's temple. "Beg for her forgiveness, and if she doesn't believe you, I pull the trigger." Derek broke completely. He sobbed, choking on his own tears, pleading into the darkness. "Natalie! Oh my God, Nat, I'm so sorry. I'm a monster. Please forgive me. I was scared. I'm sorry." Up on the catwalk, Natalie felt a strange, profound lightness wash over her. For years, this man had dictated her worth, buried her in anxiety, and made her feel utterly powerless. Now, looking at him sobbing in a wet chair, stripped of his unearned wealth and arrogant cruelty, she felt absolutely nothing but pity. "Let him go, Matteo," Natalie called out, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the warehouse. "He's not worth the bullet." Matteo smiled, a dark, proud smirk. He lowered the gun. "You hear that, Derek? A woman you tried to kill just granted you your miserable life. Leave this state. If my men ever see your face in Pennsylvania again, there won't be a conversation." Dante cut the zip ties. Derek collapsed to the floor, scrambled to his feet, and ran into the rainy night, a broken, penniless ghost. Matteo walked up the metal stairs to the catwalk. He looked at Natalie, seeing the newfound strength radiating from her. "He'll never haunt you again," Matteo said softly. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping closer to him. The adrenaline, the danger, and the overwhelming gratitude finally broke the last barrier between them. She reached up, weaving her fingers into his dark hair, and pulled him down. Their kiss was explosive, a collision of desperation, relief, and undeniable heat. Matteo wrapped his strong arms securely around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, kissing her with a fierce, possessive hunger that left her breathless and entirely grounded. When they finally broke apart, resting their foreheads together, Matteo's eyes were entirely focused. "The past is buried, Natalie. Now, I have to go secure our future." Midnight struck at the Romano estate. The grand ballroom was packed with the most dangerous, influential figures of the criminal underworld. Vincenzo, wearing a pristine white tuxedo, stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, raising a crystal glass of champagne. "To a new era," Vincenzo declared, his voice booming with arrogant triumph. My brother was strong, but he lacked the vision to expand. Under my rule, the Romano family will claim everything. Everything except your life, little brother. The heavy oak double doors of the ballroom burst open. Silence, absolute and deafening, fell over the room. Matteo Romano walked in. He was flanked by Dante, Silas, and 30 heavily armed, fiercely loyal men who had materialized from the shadows of the estate. The guards at the doors were already disarmed and kneeling on the floor. Vincenzo dropped his champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot. "Matteo, you're dead! I saw you!" "You saw me bleed," Matteo corrected, walking slowly down the center of the room. The gathered captains and bosses instantly parted for him, bowing their heads in a mix of terror and deep respect. The true king had returned. "You left me in the dirt, Vincenzo, but you forgot one crucial detail. Roots grow in the dirt." Pietro, Vincenzo's second-in-command, reached into his jacket for a weapon. Before he could even draw, a massive, slate-grey blur erupted from behind Matteo. Goliath, who had been commanded to heal, launched himself forward with the terrifying speed of a runaway train. The Neapolitan mastiff slammed into Pietro, his 160-pound frame crushing the man to the floor. Goliath's massive jaws clamped down on Pietro's forearm with a sickening crunch, pinning him to the marble while letting out a roar that shook the chandeliers. Nobody else moved a muscle. Matteo finally reached the head of the table. He looked at Vincenzo, whose arrogant facade had completely crumbled into pathetic, shivering cowardice. "I gave you wealth, I gave you power, and you repaid me with a shallow grave," Matteo said quietly. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The penalty for treason is absolute. Dante stepped forward, grabbing Vincenzo by the collar of his expensive tuxedo and dragging him away. Vincenzo screamed, begging for mercy. But the heavy doors closed behind him, cutting off his cries forever. Matteo turned to the silent room. He straightened his cuffs, his face an impenetrable mask of authority. The Romano family is back to business. The narcotic lines are severed permanently. Any man who objects can join my brother. Not a single soul objected. Hours later, as the dawn broke over the sprawling estate, Matteo walked up the grand, sweeping staircase to the master suite. He opened the door. The suite was warm, lit by the soft glow of a crackling fireplace. Liam was sound asleep in the massive adjacent guest room, and sitting by the fire, wrapped in one of Matteo's thick cashmere sweaters, was Natalie. She stood up as he entered, her eyes searching his. She saw the exhaustion, but she also saw the absolute peace in his posture. The war was over. "Is it done?" she asked softly. "It's done," Matteo answered, crossing the room and taking her into his arms. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her skin, the only thing that had kept him sane in the dark. "The empire is secure, and so are you. No more debts, no more running, no more late-night shifts, unless you want to own the hospital." Natalie let out a watery laugh, wrapping her arms tightly around his broad shoulders. The poor, terrified single mother who had walked her dog in the rain was gone. In her place stood a woman who had saved a king, broken a coward, and found a fiercely protective love she never knew she deserved. Goliath trotted into the room, his tail wagging lazily, and curled up on the expensive Persian rug at their feet. Matteo kissed the top of Natalie's head, his voice a low, permanent vow. "You pulled me out of the dark, Natalie. Now I'm going to give you the world." Wow, what an incredible journey, from a terrifying discovery in the rainy woods to the ultimate takedown of a Mafia empire. Natalie and Matteo's story proves that sometimes the darkest nights lead to the most powerful love. Who would have thought a loyal Neapolitan mastiff digging in the mud would spark a romance that completely rewrote the rules of the underworld? and watching Derek get the hard karma he absolutely deserved was incredibly satisfying. If you loved this intense, twist-filled Mafia romance drama as much as I loved sharing it with you, please hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow story lovers and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on our thrilling tales. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if your dog found Mateo? See you in the next video.